Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into it. We're going deep on the science of umami.
That fifth taste.
Exactly. You've got your sweet, salty, sour, bitter, the ones we always hear about. But umami, it's something else, often called savory, maybe brothy or meaty.
Yeah, those are common descriptions.
So our mission today is to unpack this using the sources we've gathered. We want to understand what umami really is, not just the name, but the chemistry, how we taste it, and why it took so long for it to be globally recognized.
It's quite a story. We'll connect things like old fermentation methods, the latest taste science.
And even how things like getting older or our own genetics might change how we experience flavor. It's a fascinating stuff.
Definitely. It's a taste that's, been part of cuisines for ages, but pinning it down scientifically, especially in the West, that's much more recent.
Okay, let's start there. Umami, the fifth basic taste. You said recent, but how recent? It took nearly 100 years for wider acceptance outside Japan.
That's right. Almost a century after it was first identified. It all began back in 1908. There was a Japanese chemist, Kikunai Ikeda, and he was curious about kombu seaweed broth, dashi, what gave it that unique, really satisfying taste. He managed to isolate a specific compound responsible for it.
Ah, so he actually found the molecule behind it.
He did. And he needed a name, right? So he coined umami based on the Japanese word umai, which means delicious or savory.
Umami, delicious.
That makes sense. He described it as that pleasant, savory taste, the signature of broths, cooked meats, that kind of deep, satisfying quality.
Right. So Ikeda found the compound. Let's get into the chemistry then. What actually makes umami tick?
Well, the main players are glutamates and certain nucleotides. Glutamate is derived from glutamic acid,
Which is an amino acid, right? One of the essential ones.
Exactly. One of the 20 essential for life. So when glutamic acid is dissolved in food, basically it loses a proton and becomes the glutamate anion. That specific molecule is what hits the receptors and gives us the umami taste.
Okay, so it's the glutamate form, not the acid itself, that we're tasting. Got it.
Precisely. And then you have the nucleotides. The key ones are inosine monophosphate, IMP, and guanosine monophosphate, GMP.
IMP and GMP. Where do they come from?
They're essentially breakdown products from RNA and DNA.
Okay. Now, people often talk about MSG, monosodium glutamate. How does that fit in?
Yes, MSG is a very common example. Disodium glutamate, DSG, is another. These are basically glutamate salts used specifically to add that umami flavor.
So they're like umami enhancers.
Kind of, yeah. But the sources stress that the taste itself comes from the glutamate part. The G, the sodium, or whatever else is attached, isn't the primary driver of the umami sensation itself.
That's interesting. Okay, so we know the chemicals.
Yeah.
How does our body actually pick up on this? You mentioned receptors earlier.
Right. We have specialized taste cells, mostly on the tongue, in taste buds, and they're equipped with specific receptors for umami.
And not just in one spot on the tongue, like those old taste maps suggested.
No, that old map idea is pretty much debunked. Umami perception happens across the tongue. These receptors are there.
So what are these receptors? What have scientists found?
There seem to be a couple of main types working together. One is a complex made of two protein units called TS1R1 and TS1R3.
TS1R1 and 3.
Okay. And then there are also modified versions of receptors usually found in the brain for detecting the neurotransmitter glutamate. They're called metabotropic glutamate receptors, or mGlu-Rs. Specifically, mGlu-R1 and mGlu-R4 seem involved in taste.
Wow. Brain receptors adapted for taste. That's kind of wild. Why different types?
Well, it seems they have slightly different jobs and they cooperate. The mGlu-Rs, those brain-like ones, seem particularly good at detecting glutamate on its own.
Okay.
But that TS1R1 plus TS1R3 receptor, that one's really key for sensing the synergy effect.
Energy. Okay, hold that thought. We need to circle back to that. But first, you mentioned receptors not on the tongue.
Yes, and this is where it gets really mind-bending. These same kinds of umami receptors have also been found in other parts of the body, like the duodenum.
The duodenum. That's the first part of the small intestine, right?
Exactly. Your gut can sense umami.
Seriously? Why? What's the point of tasting in your gut?
Well, the thinking is that these gut receptors send signals up to the brain, probably using the vagus nerve. And these signals might influence things like how hungry or full we feel, maybe even our long-term food preferences.
So it's part of that whole gut-brain connection we hear about.
Really clear example of it, yeah. Taste isn't just happening in your mouth, it's influencing deeper physiological responses.
Okay, mind's slightly blown. So whether it's tongue or gut, these receptors get triggered. How does that signal become the perception of taste in our brain?
Inside the taste cell, when glutamate or a nucleotide like IMP binds to its receptor, it kicks off a sort of chain reaction. Calcium levels change inside the cell, other signaling molecules like ATP get released.
Like little messages.
Pretty much. These messages are then picked up by nerve fibers that are connected to the taste cells, and those nerves carry the signal onward towards the brain. For the gut receptors, it's a similar idea, but the signal likely travels up that vagus nerve pathway.
Right, so we've got the chemicals, the receptors, the signals. What does umami actually feel like when we experience it? Is savory the whole story?
The sources describe it with a bit more nuance. It's often mild initially, but it has this characteristic lasting aftertaste. It lingers.
Oh, I think I know that feeling.
And it's strongly associated with salivation, that mouth-watering response. Some people also report a kind of unique sensation, maybe a furriness or a coating feeling on the tongue. And it seems to stimulate more than just the tongue surface. You feel it in the throat, the roof of the mouth, the back.
Yeah, like after a really good Parmesan cheese or a rich, slow-cooked stew, that depth.
Exactly that. Now, interestingly, pure umami taste on its own isn't usually considered super palatable, but its real power is in how it boosts the overall deliciousness of foods, especially when you factor in aroma, too.
So it makes other flavors better.
Massively better. Though, like other tastes, there's a sweet spot it's most pleasant within a certain concentration range. Too much isn't necessarily good.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So where do we find these umami compounds naturally? What foods should we be thinking about?
They're actually in a lot of common foods. Glutamate is high in meats, beef, pork, you name it, but also lots of vegetables. Ripe tomatoes are a classic example that's a big part of their flavor.
The tomato effect.
Right. Also Chinese cabbage, spinach, celery, and like you hinted at with the stew, cooking and processing often increases umami.
How does that work?
Things like fermentation, curing, aging, even just heating these processes break down proteins within the food. That releases the glutamate from the protein chains, making it free glutamate, which is what our receptors detect.
So that's why things like aged cheese, Parmigiano-Reggiano was mentioned.
Exactly. Parmigiano is packed with free glutamate. Same goes for fermented things like soy sauce, fish sauce, miso, natto, kimchi too, through fermentation. And nutritional yeast or yeast extracts like Vegemite or Marmite, they're basically umami bombs.
Okay. What about those nucleotides, IMP and GMP? Where are they?
IMP is mostly found in meats and fish. Things like smoked fish or fermented fish are often particularly high in it.
And GMP?
GMP tends to be higher in vegetables. Mushrooms are a famous source, especially dried shiitake mushrooms. They really concentrate the GMP.
Dried shiitake, right? They have such an intense flavor.
That's the GMP working. Shellfish are also mentioned, sometimes containing another nucleotide called adenylate that contributes.
And I was really surprised the sources mentioned breast milk.
Isn't that fascinating? Yes, for many humans, breast milk is likely the very first encounter with umami. Glutamic acid apparently makes up about half of the free amino acids in it.
Wow. So our earliest taste experiences could be fundamentally umami. That's quite profound.
It really puts taste development in a different light, doesn't it?
It does. Okay, you mentioned synergy earlier and said we'd come back to it. This sounds really important for actual cooking and eating.
It's huge, absolutely crucial. This was discovered back in the 1950s by another Japanese scientist, Akira Kunanaka. He figured out that if you combine foods rich in glutamate with foods rich in those ribonucleotides, IMP or GMP, the resulting umami taste is much, much stronger than you'd expect just by adding the two tastes together. It's not additive, it's multiplicative almost.
So like 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 in terms of flavor intensity?
Exactly that kind of effect. It's a massive amplification. And this synergy explains so many classic food pairings across different cultures. It's the science behind why they work so well.
Yeah, give us some examples, I'm thinking.
Well, the classic Japanese dashi broth is the prime example. It uses kombu seaweed, which is full of glutamate.
Right.
And katsuobushi, those dried bonito flakes, which are loaded with IMP, put them together, boom, umami synergy.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. What else?
Think about adding dried mushrooms, GMP, to a meat soup, glutamate and IMP. Or even just grating Parmesan cheese, glutamate, over a bolognese sauce made with meat and tomatoes, glutamate and IMP.
Ah, the Parmesan.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's not just adding salty or cheesy flavor, it's boosting the underlying umami.
Precisely. You're triggering that synergistic effect.
Yeah.
It's cooks intuitively understanding this, maybe without knowing the exact chemistry, for centuries.
That is incredibly cool. understanding the why behind those delicious combinations. And speaking of discovering fascinating things, unlocking new dimensions, this entire deep dive is brought to you by the All Sorts podcast.
That's us.
Think of what we do here as well, reaching into this vast ocean of information and pulling out these sparkling gems of knowledge just for you.
Like exploring umami today.
Exactly. If you love these kinds of explorations, these journeys into unexpected corners, if you live for those aha moments that connect ideas, then the All Sorts podcast is definitely your place.
We really pour our curiosity into crafting these deep dives, like a carefully prepared meal for your mind.
Nicely put. So if you're enjoying this journey into umami, just imagine what else awaits. Please head over to YouTube, search for the All Sorts podcast. If this has sparked something for you, give this deep dive a like.
Share it with someone else who loves to learn, or maybe just loves to eat.
And definitely subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube so you don't miss a single exploration. While you're there, check out our archives. There's a whole universe of other deep dives waiting.
And let's keep the conversation going beyond just listening. Find the All Sorts podcast on X, Instagram, and Threads.
Join our community. Let the algorithms know you appreciate substance, insight, maybe a little bit of wit along the way. Your engagement, honestly, it helps us keep doing this, keep digging deep and finding these hidden treasures. Okay, back to the history, that puzzle. Ikeda identifies umami in 1908. Why the nearly 100-year lag for widespread scientific acceptance in the West? What were the roadblocks?
It seems like it was a combination of factors, really. One simple but significant issue was language. Ikeda's original paper was published in Japanese.
So not immediately accessible to many Western scientists.
Right. And then there was the context of the time. Post-World War I, some Japanese nutrition research was, perhaps understandably, focused more on domestic issues, local resources, self-sufficiency.
So maybe not prioritized for international dissemination?
Possibly. But a bigger factor was probably just the sheer weight of tradition. The 4 basic tastes, sweet, salty, sour, bitter, that model was deeply embedded in science and culture across the globe for centuries.
Hard to argue with centuries of consensus.
Exactly. To overturn something that fundamental, you needed really compelling, undeniable proof. And that evidence just took a long time to build and be accepted internationally.
And didn't the whole MSG controversy complicate things later on?
Oh, absolutely. That definitely muddied the waters. In the U.S., especially in the 60s and 70s, there was this significant public fear around monosodium glutamate MSG. It got labeled Chinese restaurant syndrome.
Right, I remember hearing about that.
The sources suggest this was partly driven by a general anxiety about chemicals in food at the time, but they also point out that anti-Asian sentiment and xenophobia might have played a role in amplifying those fears. So this big controversy swirling around MSG, which is fundamentally an umami compound, likely made it harder for the concept of umami itself as a distinct and natural taste to gain acceptance.
It really shows how science doesn't happen in a vacuum, does it? Social factors, historical context, they all play a part.
For sure.
So what was the actual breakthrough? What finally tipped the scales towards accepting umami?
The real turning point came much later, around the year 2000. That's when scientists definitively identified those specific taste receptors we talked about earlier, the TES1R1 plus TS1R3 complex, and those modified MGLRs.
Finding the biological hardware.
Exactly. First in rats, then confirmed in humans. This provided the concrete physical evidence. Our bodies have dedicated machinery just for detecting glutamate and related umami compounds, separate from the receptors for sweet, salty, sour, or bitter.
That hard biological proof was key.
It was. And you also have to acknowledge the role of Ajinomoto, the company Ikeda founded. Over the years, they funded a lot of research into glutamate and umami and actively promoted the concept. Part of their motivation, reasonably, was to counter the negative press around MSG that affected their business.
So a mix of new science and, well, persistent promotion based on that science.
Pretty much. It took both to finally shift the global scientific consensus.
Okay, let's pivot to how we experience umami as individuals. Is it the same for everyone? Or does it vary?
Oh, there are definitely significant variations. Taste perception isn't uniform. One study mentioned in the sources found that our ability to perceive all 5 basic tastes tends to decrease as we get older.
So things literally taste less intense as we age.
It seems so, and that effect was apparently stronger for higher concentrations of taste substances. So really strong flavors might dull more noticeably.
Interesting. What about other differences?
The same study also looked at sex differences. It found that generally, women tended to perceive tastes more intensely than men. Though, interestingly, for umami specifically, that difference was the smallest compared to the other tastes.
Huh. Any idea why?
The sources don't delve too deeply into the why for that specific finding, but it points to complexity. And beyond age and sex, our genetics also come into play.
Genetics influence taste. How?
Yeah, through small variations in our DNA called polymorphisms. These can affect how our taste receptors are built or how they function. We know this is true for bitter taste. There are well-known gene variations, like TAS2R38, that make some people super sensitive to certain bitter compounds.
Like with Brussels sprouts for some people.
Could be related, yeah. The study cited didn't find a strong link for a sweet receptor gene in their specific analysis, but they did find an association between variations in a gene called SCNN1B and how intensely people perceived salty taste.
So our individual genetic blueprint shapes our personal taste world.
That seems to be the case. All these factors, age, sex, genetics, contribute to why you might love a food that someone else finds bland, or vice versa. It's relevant for ideas like precision nutrition, tailoring advice.
And you mentioned earlier, some people might even struggle to distinguish umami clearly.
Right, there's still some discussion about how perceptually distinct umami is for absolutely everyone. Some people, maybe termed umami hypotasters, seem to find it harder to separate umami from just the salty taste. It's also noted that if you taste pure glutamate without any salt, some people perceive it as slightly sour.
So it's not always a clear-cut, savory hit for everybody.
Might depend on the context and the individual taster.
Given all this, especially the age-related decline in taste, does umami have specific benefits or applications? Could it be useful?
The sources suggest it could be really important, actually, particularly for older adults. As taste and smell sensitivity decline with age, sometimes worsened by medications, food can become less appealing.
Leading to poor appetite and nutrition.
Exactly. So because umami enhances palatability so effectively, using umami-rich ingredients or enhancers could potentially make food more enjoyable for older people, improve their intake, and maybe help reduce risks associated with poor nutrition.
That's a really positive potential application using umami for healthy aging.
Definitely. And there's also that interesting finding about appetite regulation.
The biphasic effect.
Yeah, that umami seems to stimulate appetite during a meal, making you want to eat, but then contributes to feeling fuller and more satisfied after the meal.
Huh. Makes food appealing, but helps signal enough. That's useful.
Potentially very useful for managing intake, yes. And food manufacturers are already using this principle, adding umami to make low-sodium products taste better, for example.
Because taking salt out often makes food taste flat.
Right. And chefs, of course, they've been doing this intuitively for ages, layering umami ingredients, mushrooms, tomatoes, cheese, cured meats to create those umami bombs with incredible depth of flavor.
It really is fascinating tracing this whole story from Makita noticing something special in seaweed broth over 100 years ago.
Through the complex chemistry, the discovery of receptors in the tongue and gut, the century-long path to acceptance.
To understanding synergy, individual differences, and these potential benefits for health and cooking.
Yeah.
This deep dive really shifts how you think about flavor.
It shows taste is so much more than just 5 neat categories. It's this incredibly intricate interplay of chemistry, biology, psychology, even history and culture.
Absolutely. So as you're listening, think about your own experiences with flavor. Maybe how your tastes have changed or how you perceive foods differently from friends or family. And here's something to chew on, inspired by everything we've discussed. Knowing that umami perception changes with age and varies genetically, and knowing its power to enhance palatability and influence satiety, how can we consciously use umami, focus on it, to design food meals, products, maybe even public health initiatives that not only taste great, but actively support healthier eating habits and genuine food enjoyment for everyone, no matter their age or individual taste profile, throughout their entire lives?
That's a big question.
It is. Something to ponder next time you savor that deep, satisfying umami richness